So, how did I start beginning to understand my journey post abuse? How did I start bringing sense to me, some clarity to the self about where I originate from and how I sort of made my way through life? Well, whenever you go beyond that sort of narcissistic interject voice that's continuously taking over your life, and you can start pausing a little bit and introspecting your own self concept and your awareness of what's been going on around you and your familial situation and your own object relations with your parents, I was able to go back and really start looking at the vulnerabilities in my attachment to others. And I did that by inspecting my relationship with my parents, and in particular, how I was dominated. I was, repeatedly suppressed. I repeatedly repressed myself. My emotional capabilities and emotional intelligence were constantly critiqued and questioned. They were always, sorry, that's a cat playing with a catnip bag behind me. They're, they were always hypercritical of my emotional responses to things, telling me that I was too sensitive, etc., etc. And then I looked at the trauma in my life that happened to my siblings, especially my brother, and the problems that caused in the attachment between the children, my siblings and I, and each other, and then between my parents and I, and the misattunement that was going on in regards to looking after our vulnerabilities after being exposed to such trauma. Things like addiction and violence in the house, and eruptions, arguments, conflicts, denial from my parents as to my brother's position, which he was wrongly diagnosed for schizophrenia for. All those things that were going on, and my brother's continual fight to try and work his way out of it by intellectualizing his way through it. And I start seeing the defensive mechanisms throughout the family. And my sister was the same, but in a very different way, where she was the narcissistic extension and, you know, and acted out as so and defended herself as so, and eventually these patterns became an imprinted and definite thing. And sadly, as you start to understand your family dynamics, you start seeing yourself in it in a very different way, because you start realizing that you were a bit of a passenger more than somebody who was actually taking part. You were kind of sitting at the sidelines. And it's that lack of attachment, the familial attachment, because there was no cohesion in the family. There was little in the way of co regulation by anybody in the family at any point until our adulthood in reality. Sorry, cats love catnip, the go metaphor. Um, and that then brought a sense of clarity to the lack of attachment between us all and then our parents. And then the constant putting down and critique and denial of their own wrongdoings, the parentification of us as children throughout all that trauma, and the denial of my brother and his own emotional intelligence and his own emotional feelings and capabilities of being able to express them, the constant teasing, the name calling. I was a mistake, so I was called Smirnoff. It was brought up all the time, and it would be used as a sort of laughing point. My name was Mark, and they would call me Bark Bark, like a dog with a hare lip. That was a joke that was used constantly. And I know those things were done in jokey terms, but as a child, those things affect you. So we can start to see the gaps. We can start to feel the loss of self. And then I had body image issues. I was slightly heavy as a child. But in my mind, I was huge. But I wasn't. See, I was extremely skinny until I was 5, like pin thin. And I got my tonsils out, and then I could taste food. And then, with everything that was going on in the house, I was emotionally eating, binge eating, satisfying my need for some sort of dopamine hit to feel happy. And it was such an engaging realization that my whole life had sort of been about protecting myself via harming myself via psychological processes that I had just no idea about, defensive mechanisms and learned adaptations that caused so many gaps within my relational understanding to others. So whenever it came to relationships, I fell in love dead easy because I wanted to be seen, I wanted to be heard, I wanted to be loved. I didn't want to feel like I wasn't part of something. So I got attached very, very easily. And then whenever the inevitable happens as you're a child and breakups happen, at times I got very emotionally dysregulated, very, very upset. Without knowing why, I had no comprehension as to why I was feeling so attached and so upset whenever others around me didn't seem to react that way. And this was a repeating pattern through life. I eventually went to boarding school, or was put in boarding school whenever I was 15. And again, I was put in a boys' boarding school after being in a mixed school. And this caused chaos because there is no opposite sex and there isn't anybody around that you can really sort of get on with because you don't know anybody. And it's an incredibly harsh environment. It's not the way people think. It's not full of sissies. It's full of boys who've been there, who've been rejected and abandoned and put into an institutional um, place where they've got to board with other boys who've been through the same childhood trauma. They have no idea how to deal with it. So you get a lot of acting out, a lot of aggression, a lot of fights. And that's what I did for 2 years. I fought to survive every single day. I literally fought. And that died down after a while, but then I acted out and found drugs and smoked and did all those things. Um, and eventually led to me leaving school at 16 because I had no grasp on my academical potential because I never had self belief in myself. My children, unlike myself, have somebody like me who will sit down and read and talk to them. My parents never did any of that. They didn't teach me. They didn't want to do their homeworks. They didn't want to know. They were too busy. They were too involved in their own emotional distress. And it's a massive indicator. And then as life went on, I headed off into the outside world. I tried to go back into education and I couldn't do it. I just couldn't stay with it because I didn't know how. I didn't know how to really learn. And I went out of it and I got a job as a trainee hairdresser, believe it or not. But it was 1989, 1990. It was the rave years. It was all peace and love, and it was a trendy thing to do. And everybody, I just wanted a job. I just wanted to be out working, and it was £45 a week. And then I spent the next few years going around partying and enjoying myself and trying to find my own individuality, which I did. I managed to escape from the family dynamic and I found my own individuality in some sort of way. But I always lacked confidence. I always maintained that strong need for attachment. I always fawned in favour of others' emotions, especially whenever it came to relationships. Not so in friendships, but in relationships especially. Although later on in life I would learn that I was that way in friendships and I actually attracted some really rather narcissistic people into my life. But again, I managed to detach from all those things. And it was building this picture of then looking at how I went on to settle for somebody that I really shouldn't have. Now, albeit I have two beautiful children out of it, I would never, ever, ever regret that relationship for love nor money. And it was an experience, but I didn't learn. I didn't learn, and I ended up just jumping in with somebody who was much more psychotic, much more neurotic as well. Had a lot of vulnerable, sort of covert narcissism about her, but at the same time was incredibly somatic and alluring. So whenever you've lacked love and attachment and connection, you tend to gravitate towards people like that if it's been in your familiarity and your family, and that's what happened. So being able to detach yourself from all that and inspect your life takes time. Learning about object relations really made a massive difference. Finding Sam Vaknin made a huge difference. But the biggest difference was finding myself. Introspection, sitting down, challenging yourself. You need to have that internal dialogue and you need to go back and inspect things. You've got to clear that mind of that narcissistic interject first, though. You need to start calming that voice down and you need to start pausing and you need to challenge it every single time. Peace out. Hope that helps.